All right, so Italy's sending migrants to Albania to be processed. Albania, you don't see that every day, do you?
It's definitely caught some attention.
Yeah, and it's not just a one-off thing either. We're talking two, count them, two processing centers built by Italy on Albanian soil.
Yeah, one near a place called Gijater. And when I say near, I mean this place is huge, like 10 football fields big, at least. And there's another one right at the port, Shengjin.
Okay, so they're going all in on this. But here's the thing, Albania, they're not in the EU. So how does that even work? Are they using, like, Albanian immigration law?
That's the thing, they're not. These centers, they'll be processing asylum claims, but under Italian and EU law.
Whoa, hold up. So even though it's on Albanian soil, it's Italian and EU law that applies.
You got it. This is like totally unprecedented. First time ever an EU nation has outsourced like this whole process to a non-EU country.
Wow. So Italy's really serious about this, huh?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a big deal for the EU as a whole. You know, it raises all sorts of questions about legal jurisdiction and the whole future of, like, the EU's asylum system.
It's almost as if they're trying to create an EU border, but outside of the EU, you know? I can see why everyone's watching this so closely.
For sure, yeah. Especially those countries in the EU who've been, shall we say, hesitant to maybe share the load a little when it comes to processing asylum seekers.
Right. So speaking of all this, the first ship, the Libra, it arrived in Albania with 16 migrants on board. Sounds like a drop in the ocean, to be honest, given the scale we're talking about.
Sorry, 16, that was it. But even that, well, it wasn't exactly plain sailing.
Oh, really? What happened?
Well, of those 16, 2 of them were underage.
And I'm guessing they got sent straight back to Italy.
You got it, straight back. And it gets, well, kind of more complicated too. 2 more of those migrants, they were deemed, you know, vulnerable.
Vulnerable in what way?
Well, it could be health issues, you know, or needing special assistance that they just couldn't get at those centers in Albania.
Ah, I see. So they might have been sent back too then.
Exactly. So out of the original 16, we're potentially talking as few as 12 that were even, you know, eligible under this new agreement.
That's a really small number when you think about it like that. It makes you wonder, how do they even start to figure out things like age and vulnerability, especially when they first arrive?
That's a good question. And it's one that a lot of people have, especially those who are, well, let's just say, a bit skeptical of this whole thing. Because what happens when it's not 16 migrants? What happens when it's hundreds, thousands even?
Right, yeah. Can they really make those sorts of decisions accurately when they're dealing with those kinds of numbers? And what about the support for those who are vulnerable? Can they really provide that?
Exactly. And that's what a lot of people are worried about. It really highlights just how complex this whole thing is, both logistically and ethically. Because you're dealing with people's lives here, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's easy to forget that when we're talking about policies and agreements. These are real people making incredibly dangerous journeys, just trying to find somewhere safe. And we hear this phrase all the time, irregular arrivals. But what does that even mean?
Yeah, you're right. It's important to define our terms. Basically, it means migrants who arrive without the proper documentation.
So they haven't gone through the usual channels like applying for a visa or whatever.
Exactly. They often take huge risks to get there, like crossing the Mediterranean on those, well, you've seen the pictures, overcrowded and dangerous boats.
It's easy to forget that behind those policies are real people taking enormous risks to escape desperate situations.
Absolutely. And their stories are so important. If we're going to even begin to understand, you know, the human impact of policies like this.
And to understand the impact, we really need to hear from everyone involved, right? I mean, what did they think about all of this?
Exactly. And there are a lot of different perspectives on this, all equally important.
So let's hear those different perspectives. We've got Italy and Albania, right? Each with their own reasons for doing this. And then, of course, everyone else is watching, wondering what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And Italy's Prime Minister, Meloni, she's been pretty vocal, you know, calling this a model for the whole of Europe. The thinking being, if it's harder to claim asylum in Italy, well, you're going to see fewer people making those dangerous journeys in the first place.
I guess that makes sense, on paper at least. But is it really as simple as that? I mean, we have to think about the people too, right?
Yeah, you've got a point. It's the big question, isn't it? And this is where it gets really ethically tricky because critics of the deal, they're saying that shifting everything over to a country that isn't even in the EU, like Albania, well, that could end up undermining the rights of those asylum seekers because they have rights, you know, under the EU framework.
What kind of rights are we talking about here? Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So within the EU, if you're seeking asylum, You have a right to legal counsel, translators, and importantly, there's a standardized process for your claim to be heard. That's the system. The worry is that by, outsourcing it all, Italy might be kind of dodging some of those obligations.
Right, so these people might end up in a really vulnerable position, legally speaking.
That's the concern.
Okay, so that's Italy's side, sort of. What about Albania? What are they getting out of this whole thing?
Well, Prime Minister Rama, he's saying it's about strengthening those ties with Italy. And of course, there's a lot of talk about how this could actually help Albania join the EU further down the line.
So they're hoping to be a part of the club one day. Makes sense.
It does. But let's not forget, this is costing Italy a lot of money. We're talking over 134 million euros each year to keep these centers running.
Wow, that's a lot of cash.
It is. And a lot of critics, well, they're saying that it's just not sustainable in the long term, especially for Albania. They've got their own economic problems.
For sure. It sounds like there's a lot at stake for both countries, honestly. But it's bigger than just them, isn't it? This is an EU issue, really. So what's the rest of Europe saying? What's their take?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, really.
Mm.
Greece, for example, they're not so keen.
Really? Why not? I mean, they've been dealing with a lot of migrant arrivals too, right?
Absolutely, yeah. They're on the front lines, just like Italy.
Yeah.
But they're calling for a different approach, something that's, more unified across Europe.
Ah, I see. So rather than these individual deals, they want everyone on board.
Right. Their argument is that it's a shared responsibility. This isn't just an Italian problem or a Greek problem. It's a European Union problem. And so it needs a solution on that level.
And I guess the million-dollar question is, why is that so hard? Why can't the EU just agree on this stuff?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? There are so many factors at play. One of the biggest is how to actually divide up the responsibility for all of this. Some countries, they think that those on the front lines, like Italy and Greece, they should do more because they're, the first point of entry. But then you've got others who think it should be based on, population size or how much money a country has, the GDP.
Yeah, it's complicated for sure. Politics, economics, and of course, the humanitarian side of it all. It's no wonder it causes so much debate and disagreement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really is a tangle. And it's so easy to get lost in the weeds of it all. The policies, the agreements, all of that. But we can't forget the human side. We're talking about people's lives here.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the bigger picture. But those 16 migrants on the Libra, they really bring it home, don't they? You put yourself in their shoes for a second, risking it all to get to safety, to start a new life, only to end up caught in this, this whole mess. It makes you wonder, what happens to them next? And what about all the others who are going to follow in their footsteps?
That's it. That's the question. What does all of this mean for the future? Will this actually stop people from coming? Or will it just, push them to other, even more dangerous routes? These are big questions.
It's a tough one for sure. But I get where Italy's coming from, They're in a really tough spot. There's just not enough resources, and it feels like they're dealing with this on their own,
Yeah, and you could argue that this whole thing with Albania, it's just a symptom of a bigger problem, right? The EU just can't seem to figure out a way to approach this as a, united front.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And yet here we are with this new approach, and it could have huge consequences, not just for those trying to claim asylum, but for the future of EU migration policy as a whole,
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, will it even work?
Oh,
Will it actually make people think twice about trying to get to Italy? Or will it just mean they try a different, more dangerous route?
And that's not even addressing the ethical side of it all, is it?
Right, because if we're talking about outsourcing, asylum processing to a country that maybe doesn't have the same human rights record,
Yeah.
well, that raises some serious questions, doesn't it? Are those seeking protection really going to get the same treatment, the same access to legal support?
It's a big gamble, that's for sure. And what if it pays off? For Italy, at least. What if this actually works and the numbers go down? Are we going to see other EU countries doing the same thing?
Yeah.
Copying their homework, so to speak.
It's possible, yeah. If it looks like it's working, that it's quote-unquote successful, you can bet other countries are going to sit up and take notice, especially those who are, let's just say, feeling the pressure.
But as we've been saying, success in this context, it's not so simple, is it? It's all about numbers, isn't it? Reducing the number of arrivals. But it doesn't really get to the heart of why people are migrating in the first place, does it?
You hit the nail on the head. It's easy to get caught up in the statistics, but we can't lose sight of the human beings behind the numbers. These are individuals, families, fleeing from war, persecution, poverty. Their stories matter, and so do their rights, their safety, their dignity. All of that has to be front and center when we're talking about this stuff.
It's a good point, and it's so easy to forget that when we're talking about something as, well, as huge and complex as this. But ultimately, it's people's lives we're talking about here, isn't it? And those lives, they're being shaped by decisions made miles away. In Brussels, in Rome, even in Tirana. It's a lot to process.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think what this whole situation with Albania shows is that there are no easy answers here. This issue of migration, it's a global one. It's complex, it's messy, and it's something we're going to be grappling with for, well, for a long time to come, I think. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about it, questioning things, trying to find a better way forward.
And that's what we've tried to do today, right? Take a deep dive into this new development, try to understand it from all angles. We may not have all the answers. In fact, we probably have more questions now than when we started. But if we've encouraged you, the listener, to think about this a bit more, well, then we've done our job, I think.
I completely agree. And maybe, just maybe, it'll spark some conversations, some debates, because that's what we need more of.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. Put yourself in the shoes of someone seeking refuge, seeking a better life for themselves, for their families. What would you want? What kind of world would you hope to find?
It's a question worth pondering.
It really is.
Yeah.
A lot to think about. Until next time.